In programming, there are often situations where you need to repeat a certain action multiple times. Let's say you wanted to display a message hello world in the console 10 times. You could write this code hello world in the console and then you could copy this 9 more times and that will be hello world 10 times in the console. But what if we want to console log the same thing for 100 times or 1000 times? Just copy pasting this same line will be very inefficient, and JavaScript provides us with a better way to handle these repetitive tasks with the help of loops. Loops allow us to execute a block of code repeatedly and also make the code concise rather than copy pasting the same code multiple times. The most common type of loop in JavaScript is the for loop, and here is the basic structure of a for loop. We have three parts in these brackets, and the first part is the initialization, the second part is the condition, and the last part is the final expression. The initialization part is where you first declare a loop counter variable and you set the initial value. For example, we can declare a variable named I and set the initial value to be 0. And then we have the condition, which is a Boolean expression that is checked before each iteration of the loop. And if it evaluates to true, the loop continues, and if it doesn't, then the loop stops. And in our example, the condition should be that whenever the I is less than 10, we need to continue executing this code. And the last part that we have is the final expression. This expression is executed at the end of each loop iteration, and usually we update the loop counter in this part. For example, we have the I variable here, we initialize it to 0, and then the condition is that it should be less than 10. And in the final expression part, we increment this I variable at every iteration, and this is just the equivalent of I plus equals 1, where we add 1 to I. But if you remember the increment operator, this is where it is useful. We use this increment operator in for loops usually to increment the counter of the for loop. And then just like functions, we have these curly braces, and inside the curly braces we define the code that needs to be executed for this for loop. And in our case, we just need to console log hello world, so we can copy this console log message and place it inside of the for loop. So to reiterate what happens here, we initialize our I variable to be 0, and this is the counter of our for loop. And then this condition is checked before each iteration, and as long as I is less than 10, the loop continues. Inside of our for loop, we log the message hello world in the console. And at the end of each iteration, except only logging this message, we also increment the counter I by 1. And this means that on first iteration we have I as 0 and we log message hello world. And on the second iteration we have I as 1 and then we also log the hello world in the console. And this continues until I is 9 and then we log the hello world one more time. And then when the I is equal to 10, this condition is false, meaning the I is not less than 10. And in that case we stop executing this for loop. And this block of code does exactly the same as this first part, except we are using 3 lines of code except 10. And if we needed to log this hello world 100 times, for example, instead of 10, we could just increment this I condition and set it to be less than 100. And we will still use the 3 lines of code instead of 100 lines of code, and so on. And that's the advantage of for loops in JavaScript. They allow us to execute a block of code repeatedly for automated tasks, and they make our code more concise. And this is the for type of loop in JavaScript, but we have other types of loops. For example, we have the while loop. And the while loop is another useful type of loop, and it keeps executing a block of code as long as the specified condition is true. And we specify that condition after the while statement. We open the braces, and here is where we will write the condition of this loop. And then we open the curly braces similar to for loop, and here is where we will write the execution code of this while loop. Let's say we wanted to count down from 10 to 1. We can define a variable here, let's say count, and it will start from 10. And here inside of the execution block, we will log that count. And after logging this count, we will also decrement it by 1 by using the decrement operator. And with this code, on each iteration, we log the value of count and then we decrement it. And our condition for this while loop should be if the count is greater than 0, then we should log this count, and otherwise we exit out of this while loop. And as you can see in the console, we will have 10, 9, 8, 7 and until 1. And when we set the value of count to 1, after that we will also decrement it and it will be equal to 0. So on the next iteration we will have 0 is greater than 0 and this will evaluate to false and this will exit out of this while loop. Similar to while loops, we also have the do while loops in JavaScript. And the main difference is that this type of loop guarantees that our code will be executed at least once, even if the condition is initially false. We define do while loops by starting with do keyword and then the execution block of our code. And then we have the while and the condition that is inside of the while brackets. And this type of loop is less common than the while loop, but it can be useful in certain situations where you need to perform an action at least once before checking a condition. For example, if we set the same condition as we have in our while loop, which is count is greater than 0, since we already decremented our count value to 0, if I log the value of count here, you can see that it is set to 0 now. And if we try to console.log in this do while loop the value of the count, this condition is false since this evaluates as 0 is greater than 0 and that should mean that this shouldn't be executed, but that's the case of the while loop and inside of the do while loop we execute this at least once and as you can see we have the 0 printed in the console and only after the first iteration it will see that the counter is not greater than 0 and that is where it will stop this loop. And let's also talk about infinite loops in JavaScript. It's important to be mindful of not getting stuck in infinite loops. These are loops where the condition never becomes false, like this condition in this do while loop or this condition in this for loop. And this causes your code to run endlessly and it will also result in crashing the browser. And for that we need to always make sure that our for loops has a way to eventually terminate. Here is an example of an infinite loop. We can define a for loop and set the initial counter to be 0. And then we can check if the I is greater than equal to 0. And in that case, we will increment the I variable. And here you want to execute any code. Let's say you just want to console log some message. This message will keep printing forever. And that is because we started this I variable at 0 and we increment this variable on every step. This just means that I will be 0 and then it will be 1, 2 and then this will go to infinity like 1000 and then to plus infinity. And this condition basically will never become true and our loop will be executing forever. And we also have for in and for off loops in JavaScript and these are for iterating over objects and arrays. For in loop iterates over the properties of an object. And for off loop iterates over the values of an array, or it can also iterate on an iterable object like strings, sets and maps, and this will make more sense as we learn about the objects and arrays in JavaScript. And we can also control these loops by using the break and continue statements in JavaScript. We can use break to immediately exit the loop, and we can use the continue to skip the rest of the current iteration and move on to the next one. For example, we can have the same for loop where we initialize the I variable and then we set some condition, let's say I is less than 100, and then we will increment our I variable. For now, let's just console log I here, which will be from 1 to 100 numbers. Actually, let's just set this to 10 so that we can see all of the numbers in the console. And here we can add a conditional. Let's say we are searching for number 5 in this I variable. We can set a condition that if I is equal to 5, and let's say in this case we want to exit out of this loop and we don't want to continue any further because we found the number we were looking for. We can set some console log message here saying that stopping the loop at 5. And on the next line we can use the break statement and this will exit out of this for loop, which means that we will only log 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 numbers in the console and after that we will exit this loop. And that is how we can use the break statement in our for loops. Now let's see how we can use the continue statement in a for loop. But let's say this time we want to only log the odd numbers on the screen, meaning 0, 2, 4 and so on. And for that, let's get rid of this condition here. We can add another condition and check if this number is odd by doing $2 and this should not equal to 0. This basically means we are dividing the number by 2. For example, let's say we are on 4th iteration. This will be 4 divided by 2 and the remaining part will be 0. So this condition will be false. But if the number is 5, for example, 5 divided by 2 and the remaining part of that will not be 0, so this condition will be true. And in that case, when this condition is true, we want to continue our iteration, meaning we don't want to log this number on the screen. As you can see, for now we have from 0 to 9. But if I set continue statement in this condition case, you can see that we only log these 0, 2, 4, 6 and 8 numbers on the screen.